Hi, and welcome to this live reading from The Scent of Gardenias by Lorraine Haas, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. July 1941, Milton, Florida. The night air, hot and thick, clung to Margaret Rose as she threw her weight against the hulking behemoth. Her hands had grown slick with sweat against the Packard's trunk. Her fingers slipped, and she stopped to wipe them against the cotton dress she'd borrowed from her sister Franny. A moan escaped her lips as she followed the line of sweat running past her knees to her best pair of bleached white cotton socks already covered in red clay dust. Margaret bit her lip. She dared not break down there, or her brother Edsel would tell her to stay home. It was her chance to escape the farm for one night and have an adventure such as she'd only dreamed of during days of endless chores and caring for the younger children. Almost 17, she would soon be a woman, and nothing, not even her father, would hold her back then. Beside her, her brother whispered, "Maggie, put your back into it." "What?" Nellie called out from her perch in the front seat. With a boost from a wooden milk crate, she sat steering the family car toward the main road. Edsel peered around the Packard and mouthed, "Quiet." He shook his head and sighed. Margaret knew that he would bear the brunt if they got caught. Bringing Nellie into the plan had been a last-minute decision. While Nellie had crossed her heart and hoped to die, not to say anything, the chance of them being found out was still a possibility. After they made it to the main road, Nellie would run home, quietly climb through the girl's bedroom window, and go to bed. But only after the promise of a penny candy reward. They had to hope Nellie would keep their secret, at least until they'd returned. As long as punishment came after the dance, Margaret could deal with it. By then, she would already have won. Edsel grunted as his bronzed, muscular arms tensed with another effort. At least she'd been spared helping out in the cotton fields that year. Her arms retained the alabaster glow of her childhood. Focused again on the task, Margaret Rose pushed, but the hulking Packard fought against any forward momentum. After what seemed like an interminable time of inching the behemoth up the steady incline of the driveway, the car's tires increased their rotations. The crunch of gravel came as a welcome reward for their efforts and was heaven to her ears. They had made it to the main road. Margaret could barely contain herself as she grinned at Edsel. He winked and returned her smile. Another big push, and they would have the vehicle far enough away from the house to start the engine. She let go of the bumper as she swept the dirt from her dress. The cloud of debris floated up before settling back on her and the car. She frowned. Edsel clenched his jaw. "Come on, you wanted to do this." Her chin quivered, and she forced back her anger. "I didn't know it was going to be this hard. Look at my dress, my shoes, and socks." Tears sprang to her eyes, but she fought against them. This wasn't how she'd imagined showing up to her first adult dance, soaked to the bone with sweat staining her dress and covered in a coating of the all-too-familiar clay. His mouth pinched, and the gesture reminded her of her father's disapproving glare. She sighed, not wanting to act like a child or to appear ungrateful. "I'm sorry. I should have put them in the car to change later." Edsel shot her another derisive look. She clamped her lips together, praying her apology would have the desired effect. At that point, he could take the car and refuse to take her if she continued with her tirade. She'd daydreamed all week of what to expect and what she would wear. The anticipation had been a delicious respite during the ending cooking, cleaning, and childcare. They were so close. She couldn't give up, not now. As soon as they cleared the rhododendron hedge, they would be safe. The sound of a shotgun chambering stopped them in their tracks. Her eyes met his. In them, she spied the mirror of her own resignation and fear. A knot formed in her chest as her lips trembled and her face turned ashen. Her stomach clenched. They'd been caught. She grabbed Edsel's arm, but he shook free from her as beads of sweat dotted his upper lip and forehead. He wiped them with his hand while his legs locked and his back straightened in anticipation of the confrontation. They moved toward the front of the car, where their father stood. J.T. Locke was not a tall man, but what he lacked in stature he made up for in bulk. Decades of working in the cotton fields as a youngster had transformed the pale Irish boy into a leathery brown man who cracked walnuts with his calloused and gnarled hands, spat tobacco through stained teeth, and wielded a power in the community unseen among those not endowed with wealth or privilege. Nellie, with her button nose and scraped shins, had leapt from the car. She stared wide-eyed at her father. He tilted his chin with a simple, "Git." The timid girl of 11 scampered back to the house, her wails trailing behind her on the air. Margaret wondered if it was less of being found out or more that she'd lost out on the candy reward for helping them. J.T. widened his stance, planting his worn leather boots in the dirt, blocking their path. Worse than the shotgun propped against his chest was his penetrating stare. Margaret Rose dropped her gaze to the ground and clutched her arm behind her back. Her hand twisted her wrist, the discomfort keeping her focused. Their father spat tobacco juice, and as it landed, a few wet droplets hit Margaret Rose's Mary Jane's before sliding off the toe cap. Heat rushed into her body, but she clenched her jaw for fear of saying something she would regret. Every fiber sought desperately to fight back, but she wouldn't win against the man. Besides, a foot out of line on her part would affect her brother's punishment. Shame flooded her. After she'd cajoled Edsel to take her to the dance, he, not she, would face the harsher consequences. The seconds ticked on. The only sound disturbing the night's silence was the choir of crickets and frogs. Sweat dripped against her neck as she kept her gaze on her shoes. Finally, their father spoke. "Seems like I caught me some car thieves. I wonder if I should call up the police." Margaret Rose took a step forward. Her hands balled into fists, but Edsel pulled her back to his side. "It's my fault, sir. I accept full responsibility." "Do you now?" "Yes, sir, I do. As the eldest, I shouldn't have been a bad influence on Maggie here. I led her astray to help me." Margaret Rose wanted to cry out that it wasn't true, but Edsel's grip on her arm tightened. He would take the punishment, their father would mete out. Not that she would get off scot-free. Cold sweat made her weaken, and she worried she would faint. She chewed the inside of her mouth nervously. Her father glanced at her before he motioned to the hedge. Margaret Rose bit her cheek harder so as to not cry. She would never give him that satisfaction. She stepped over to the bushes and surveyed the branches. Experience had taught her that picking a weak branch meant he would pick his own, much tougher one, or that more licks would be in store. Her legs quivered at the agony to come. She looked further into the hedge and found a medium branch with a thickness she suspected would meet his approval. After snapping it from the bush, she stripped the leaves from the bark, cutting her palm. Her desire to suck at the stinging cuts was strong, but she simply handed the branch to him. Then she faced the back of the car, bracing herself. But her father spoke. "You two got this up here, you take it back, the same way you got it here." Margaret bristled at the thought of pushing the car back down to the house, but Edsel only nodded. He went to the driver's door, put the car in neutral, and manned the steering wheel. Margaret gritted her teeth as she struggled to push against the trunk, each turn of the wheels taking her closer to her fate. After a difficult three-point turn, Edsel steered the car back toward the house. Finally, with the help of a downward slope into the yard, they parked the vehicle in its normal spot. The two of them panted out their efforts. Her arms shook from the hard work as they waited for further instruction. "You wait for me behind the barn," he motioned at Edsel with his head, and her brother stole her a glance before stalking off into the night. Margaret's face reddened and her eyes squeezed shut. She faced the car, hitching up the dress with one hand to expose her calves. She took a deep breath as she waited for the first strike of the branch. Slap! Tears slid down her cheeks, but she didn't cry out. She bit her lips so hard she could taste the blood. Another one. But it wasn't the sting of the blows affecting her. It was her desire to scream. "I hate you," Margaret cursed under her breath. Finally, he lowered the switch. "I expected better of you." With that, he dropped the branch and turned toward the barn. Her legs pulsed with the heat of the stings. She still clutched at the dress, but it had already fallen over the wounds, and red marks dotted the dirty fabric. She pushed her shoulders back and limped toward the house with its peeling white paint. A single bulb cast a yellow glow over the door as the miller moths circled their doom. She made it inside without slamming the screen or screaming at the top of her lungs. Poor Edsel would receive the leather strap, and it wouldn't be confined to his legs. Margaret rushed through the dim living room, where a solitary lamp shone. She made her way through the bedroom where the boys slept, then from there into the girls' room. She glanced back past the last bed to the closed doorway of their parents' bedroom. Does Mama know, or even care? Her expression hardened and her mouth pinched. She would never be like her mother, who put up with a mean drunk to stay stuck in a 5-room hovel with 10 children. Margaret Rose would leave as soon as she could and never come back. Moving past the girls' room, she made her way to the lean-to attached to the kitchen that they used as a bathing area. She tore off the filthy dress and flung it to the ground. Underneath, her mended full-slip pair of white cotton panties and bra were dark with stains of sweat. Pumping water into a chipped ceramic bowl, she freed a frayed wash rag with her free hand and wet it before wringing it out, avoiding the cuts on her hand. Even with a light touch, the broken skin on her legs brought a rush of stinging pain. She bit her lip to suppress the moan, but found the cut there swollen too. She swallowed and took in a calming breath, not wanting to wake the sleeping girls. She raised one leg to see the tracks of welts and blood where the switch had torn her flesh. Gingerly, she applied the cloth to the areas, wincing with each dab. After one leg had been cleaned, she set the wash rag back in the bowl, watching the water turn dark pink from the blood and clay. She finished tending to the other leg before her emotions got the best of her, then she slumped to the wooden floor. Deep sobs overtook her. Her stomach clenched as she curled into a ball, rocking with the multitude of emotions pulling at her. How she hated her father. He never allowed her or Franny to go anywhere for fun or do anything that didn't require her younger brothers and sisters to tag along. Every day was a constant array of chores and more chores. She helped with the young'uns, washed the dishes, worked in the garden, cleaned the laundry. Their father had even forbid a radio for them to listen to at night. He considered it a foolish waste of money and time that could otherwise be spent on more chores or learning. By learning, he meant understanding how to be wives and mothers. Yet that didn't stop him from heading out to his fraternity meetings. Those were the nights their family cowered in their beds as he stumbled home belligerent and drunk. Even Edsel had taken to sleeping in the barn on those nights. She wiped her nose with the dress she discarded. Then she wadded it up and threw it against the wall. How she wanted to rip it to shreds, but it was the only decent dress Franny owned, and she'd let Margaret borrow it for tonight. Margaret's dresses consisted of flour sacks her mother had sewn for the girls. Of those, any with a pattern had to be reserved for church or going to town for supplies. Margaret begged her mother for a store-bought dress, reasoning that her younger sisters would also wear it. But Ma had refused. It wasn't fair. Franny had a store-bought dress, but their father had only approved it since she would need one for any fella courting her. As Franny had grown older, her father often commented on her becoming an old maid. At 19, Franny was the oldest child still at home. Margaret worried about her sister, who had a childlike nature about her. She sighed and stared at the dress. But instead of remorse, more anger bubbled up inside. Like their mother, Franny simply accepted a life of children and poverty. Ma's horrible excuses for Pa and his actions, though, were what made Margaret so upset. On the rare occasion that Margaret had questioned her about Pa's behavior, her mother had replied that he hadn't been like that before the war. Margaret didn't care for her constant talk about the Depression and the war. That had been a lifetime ago, before her time. She rested her cheeks between her fists. All she knew was that she would never have the life she wanted if she stayed close to home. She wanted to travel, to be her own woman. Why is that so hard? Everyone always telling her to remember her place. Her attitude had kept many of the mothers in the church steering their sons toward other prospects for marriage. Margaret used a towel to wipe her eyes. As she pulled herself up from the floor, the slip fell from her shoulder. The fabric stretched against her body. Where Franny's frame was thin and willowy, Margaret Rose's body blossomed toward womanhood, and her shapely figure often caused a head or two to turn when she walked by a group of men. Perhaps that was where her power lay, in the way she looked. She swiveled in the mirror, pulling the shift tight against her body. At first, she felt dismayed by the burgeoning lumps that strained against the buttons of her blouses and caused her brothers to make jokes. Thankfully, her mother had allowed her a new brassiere, which she quickly filled. For the first time, she realized that growing into womanhood would help her find a way out. Her thoughts took on an urgency. She was no longer a child, and she would make her own decisions on how to live her life. She rubbed her arms and flexed her shoulders, tight from pushing the car back to the house, and from the tension she'd held during the punishment. She tried not to feel sorry for herself, but resentment had taken hold like a burr and wouldn't let go. Margaret Rose brushed her honey-colored hair and braided it from behind her. As her fingers flew through knotting the braids, and her frustration bounced from her father to her mother to Franny. Franny was so mild-mannered. She felt the need to go along with everything and was always so good-natured, as if she didn't long for a different life like Margaret did. Then there was Edsel. He could easily escape, but didn't. Am I the only one who feels imprisoned? She promised herself she wouldn't end up trapped like her mother, with so many mouths to feed and so little to provide. Her days wouldn't be spent wiping noses or bottoms or kowtowing to a brute of a man. She took the bowl of dirty water to the back door, hitched the screen door open with her hip, and listened. Thankfully, the only sound was of crickets and not the slapping of leather. She dumped the bloody water onto the ground before closing the door behind her. She switched off the light, then made her way through the stuffy room to the bed, with the aid of moonlight filtering through the lace curtains. Faint snores and a smattering of sniffles from Nellie carried to her ears. Walking past the bed with the younger girls, she made her way to her bed. Nellie sprawled in the middle of the bed, and Franny's back faced the wall. As the spring squeaked at her weight, Franny stirred. How was it? Later, go back to sleep. The iron bedstand creaked as she settled on the lumpy feather mattress. She pulled the light sheet over her and shoved a pillow under her head, tears spilling again. Maggie? A warm hand found her arm. Go to sleep, Franny. Margaret Rose's breath caught as she remembered the damage to Franny's only good dress. She hoped she would be able to get the blood out. Why am I such a horrible sister? She pounded her pillow as conflicting emotions roared inside her. Exhausted, spent, and sore, she fell asleep in the dimming moonlight. As she drifted off, resolve coursed through her body, and with it came a new vision of her future. She could be and would do better. She could feel it. Change was coming.